Good morning, Europe, but good evening, Australia. Welcome to a new webinar on our webinar series on homelessness and housing first. We're very glad today to see you all here. I think it's exciting that we today are having a conversation with our Australian colleagues. We usually explore projects around Europe, but today is time to have a space for our guests in Australia. They are making a big effort today because of the time. So it's the evening there, so we do appreciate your effort today. Let me introduce you the speakers today. So we're going to have Kate Colvin, who is the CEO of Homelessness Australia, the national peak body for homelessness on homelessness in Australia, in a growing housing crisis, an overview of the current trends and the Australian Homelessness Service response. Then we will have Rosie Dodd, who is a team leader of the Melbourne Street to Home program, a support program applying Housing First principles, and she's also a Housing First Europe Hub training alumni. And finally, we'll have Tina Ugle, who is the managing director of Noongar Mia Mia on adapting Housing First to meet the unique cultural context of Noongar First Nations Australia. So as you can see today, we will explore the multifaceted issue of homelessness and delve into the innovative approach of Housing First within the Australian landscape, from its historical roots to its current implementation and the tailored adaptations to the diverse cultural needs. So this webinar aims to provide a comprehensive understanding of this critical topic, and I can't think of a better way to start this webinar rather than giving the floor to Kate so she can tell us about the context and the regions and the roots of Housing First in Australia. Kate, welcome.
Thanks so much, Arturo. Thanks for that warm welcome. And it's lovely to see everyone there. I feel very far away, but of course, it's fantastic with technology that we can all have this conversation. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this conversation from Wurundjeri and Bunurong country in the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd acknowledge also that this land, the sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. So as we talked about, I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of homelessness in Australia and then about that history of Housing First implementation. So first of all, I want to, I share screen so you can see I've got some slides. So first of all, an overview of homelessness in Australia. You can see pictured here this woman sleeping in a tent in the beautiful bush in Australia, but obviously, yeah, a really difficult situation to be sleeping in a tent. It's right at the moment, it's quite hot here. I'm in Melbourne. Rosie and I are in Melbourne, and Tina is in Perth. Of course, it's just at the end of summer. And so I think you can even see in this picture, it looks pretty hot. So it's a really uncomfortable environment to be sleeping in a tent. So what can I just tell you really briefly about Australia is you can see from this picture that Australia is a very big country. So it's as big as Europe, but we have a much, much smaller population. So most of the population is in the cities and on the coast, particularly the East Coast, but though there are people living right across the country. And you can see in this slide, the map really of homelessness in Australia. So you can see the capital cities in Brisbane, Sydney, down here in Melbourne, and across where Tina is in Perth over here. You can see that there's a lot of homelessness in those capital cities, but what you can also see is these dots right across the country, and what those dots are is mostly remote Aboriginal communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that overrepresentation of First Nations people among people experiencing homelessness. So it's a picture of concentrations of homelessness in urban centres, but also concentrations of homelessness. And up here in the top of the country, this is mostly First Nations people living in these remote areas. That's not a big city up at the top. So we have enormous overrepresentation of First Nations people among those who are experiencing homelessness. So on the left here, we've got a picture of all of the Aboriginal nations in Australia. And so when I started, I talked about I'm based in the Kulin Nation, which is down here in Melbourne. But as you can see, there's all of this diversity. So these are all recognised different First Nations nations. And before colonisation, this land has been settled and people living here for around 65,000 years. So it's actually the oldest living culture in the world. And the history and context for this overrepresentation is that Australia was colonised a couple of hundred years ago, and it was really a brutal kind of takeover of land and hard to talk so much. And a really challenging history. It was a brutal takeover of land. There was forced labour. There was exclusion of First Nations people from economic participation, actually also from citizenship until the 1960s. And so that history of dispossession and history of exclusion manifests now as disadvantage across many domains, including overrepresentation in homelessness. But alongside that history is also a history of resistance and creation of organisations that have, like Noongar Mia Mia, delivered services and support and campaigning for First Nations people. So it's not just a picture of disadvantage, it's also a picture of resistance. So when we talk about homelessness in Australia, we use quite a broad definition of homelessness. So we're not just talking about rough sleeping. So that picture that I showed you with all of the dots, where you can see where people are homeless, is a picture that captures severe overcrowding and also people sleeping in homeless accommodation. We count all of this as homelessness, because if you don't have a proper home, in other words, if your dwelling is not adequate, or if you don't have tenure, then you're counted as being homeless in Australia. So what I want to do is give you a bit of a picture. This picture is a little bit complicated, so I'll talk to you about what it's showing. But essentially, this is the age spectrum of who's experiencing homelessness in Australia. So you can see that there's very large amount of homelessness among younger people. And a lot of this, what we're looking at, is family homelessness. So we've got, in the really high spikes, we've got many of the people in these high spikes would be heads of families, and then accompanied by a lot of these children. And so what we also have, and particularly in this age bracket here, is a lot of unaccompanied children coming to homeless services. So right down the bottom in the blue, that's the people who are rough sleeping. So you can see in Australia, even some children rough sleeping, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But we've also got in the blue people living in supported accommodation for the homeless, so temporary shelters and temporary housing. And then we also count people who are couch surfing, so that's in the orange. And then in the red here is people who are staying in boarding houses. So we call boarding houses, I think they're called different things in different countries, but we mean buildings where there's people just have a room. They don't have their own kitchen or their own bathroom. They might be sharing those facilities. And then in the purple is all the severe overcrowd. So like many countries in Europe, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. And so particularly since COVID, we've had this massive spike in rent and a massive drop in vacancy rates. And so that's made it really incredibly difficult for people on low income to compete in the private rental market, and particularly with the low vacancy rates, for anyone who's disadvantaged to compete with other people who are competing for those rental properties. And alongside that, we have a very low proportion of social housing. So whilst the UK, for example, has 20% social housing as across the whole housing spectrum, in Australia it's only 3.8%. So it's very difficult in homeless services to can't get people into private rental accommodation because the rents are really high and the market's really competitive, but we also can't really struggle to get people into social housing. It's very long wait lists and there's not very much of it. So how does the homelessness system work? We don't have a rights-based system. So the homelessness services across the state, so there's a different set of homeless services in each of the different states. It's a sort of state-by-state system, and it has all of the many features that are probably in countries in Europe in a homelessness service system, where there's emergency accommodation and different types of support provision. But in each of the states, there's a set amount of resources for homelessness service delivery, and when those resources are run out, then homeless services have to ration those services to people, have to make really difficult choices about who gets access to accommodation, who gets access to support, to try and make those dollars stretch as far as possible. But also often those resources just completely run out and people are turned away with no workers to, because there's no workers to assist them, or because the accommodation resources have run out. And so that's why I showed you originally, that's why essentially we end up in a situation where we have children who are homeless. And I know in a lot of countries there's a rights entitlement, particularly for children, to have temporary accommodation. But unfortunately in Australia we don't have that yet. And so oftentimes what would happen when a family approaches a homelessness service is they would be provided with temporary accommodation for a period of time, but not for as long as they need. And then they will end up couch surfing, or as you can see in the images here, sleeping in cars or sleeping in tents. So where does that put Housing First? Because obviously it's really difficult to deliver Housing First in that environment where we've got really constrained capacity to provide ongoing support, and where we don't have very much access to housing. So initially some pilot programs were created around Housing First. So first one in Adelaide, which is the pink spot here, in 2005. And then in 2008, our national government created a national homelessness strategy called the Road Home. And that then was the springboard for developing a number of Housing First pilots to test the model around the country. They were called Street to Home. And so there were pilots created in Melbourne, which is here, Sydney, and then Brisbane. And then when we had COVID, and Melbourne, where I am, had the ignominious kind of situation of having the most lockdowns of any country in the world. We were in lockdowns during COVID for months and months. And during that time, people were provided, who were rough sleeping, were provided with accommodation into hotels. And then there was an effort to provide transition for people out of hotels and into long-term housing. And we went for a massive scaling up then of Housing First like programs. Actually, they were quite low fidelity, but they were talked about as being Housing First programs. So it was ongoing. It was housing provided for around 18 months and support for that long as well. And we went from the Streets to Home pilots, which are really only about 50 or 100 households. Rosie might correct me if that's a little bit wrong, but I think it's about 50 or 100 households who are able to be provided with a Street to Home program, to the government in Melbourne resourcing more than 1,800 people were provided with housing and support, and in Sydney around 1,000, and bits and pieces of similar programs in some of the other cities, but at a much smaller scale. So Melbourne and Sydney were the big ones. But firstly, they were quite low fidelity, those programs, so people didn't necessarily have much choice about their housing, and they were not necessarily delivered in a way that met the other principles either. And the worst aspect of those programs is that they were then defunded after a period of time. So we started off with more than 1,800 people put into these programs, and then the resources for the housing was discontinued, and many people had to be exited into other housing that could be found for them, often private rental that was possibly too expensive, or into boarding houses, or in the best case scenario, they were able to be got into other social housing. But it was a mixed approach, and some people would have been exited to homelessness. And the other aspect of those programs is that the support was also not support for some people was continued, but not support for everybody. And so whilst, people might have made great progress in their housing and support that they had, they then often lost access to support and tenancies as a consequence discontinued. So it's been a very challenging time having that program, which we thought was going to be like a really significant step change, going from, 100 or so places providing housing and long-term support to people to this really significant level of program. But now we're down to, in Victoria, which is where Melbourne is, down to only having capacity of around, I think it's 300 or 400. So the program Homeless to a Home is continuing, but in a much smaller scale. And so then what we have, like many countries, is a lot of people who really do need a Housing First program tend to bounce around homeless services and not be getting the housing and support they need. So that's it from me. And Rosie's going to talk to you about what Housing First implementation has been like from a service provider perspective.
Thanks, Kate. So I would like to begin as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm calling in from right now. So I'm on the lands of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people, and I also regularly work on Bunurong land of the Kulin Nation. And like Kate said, this is the oldest living continuous culture in the world. And as practitioners in homelessness services, we owe so much to be learning and growing and educating ourselves continuously from the strength and resilience of First Nations people in Australia. And this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I should begin with an apology to say that some of you might have been expecting Leah Watkins, my fabulous colleague who works in Western Australia, and I will credit her for the ideas and inspiration for what I'm going to talk to this morning for you. But a group of us were away last week having a fantastic conference as Housing First trainers in Australia, and we've taken home fantastic memories, but some people also took home COVID. If anyone was expecting Leah, she sends her love and her apologies. So as Kate said, I am going to speak to the implementation of service provision as I see it. And I wanted to point out some particular bright spots that I think sometimes have occurred in Australia in spite of our context, as Kate has outlined. A little bit about me, my links to this project. I've worked in homelessness services now in Melbourne for just under 10 years, and most of that time has been in the one team, so Melbourne Street to Home, one of those pilot programs Kate spoke to. And in late 2019, I had the privilege of joining cohort 3 of the Train the Trainer program through the Europe Hub. We like to joke it's a bit like Eurovision, with Australia just jumping on in there to your wonderful continent. And maybe just for some context as well, after going on our training visits to Europe, 4 of us from Australia went, and we realised that there was a need for a local set of principles as part of an effort to ground the work and provide clarity on what Housing First is and is not. So we undertook some work to review the existing principles from Europe, United Kingdom, US, Canada, and we drafted what has now become the Australian Housing First Principles. And it's important to note these were always written with an understanding that there would be further work needed to adapt them to be specific and relevant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it's so great we've got Tina here to speak to that next. I think just in terms of a general reflection, I made the most of travelling across the other side of the world to join the cohorts for Train the Trainer. And I visited some services, and people were so generous to welcome me and show me around their local areas. And based on that and conversations with colleagues in Europe and here, and having lots of time with the wonderful Joe Prestige from Homeless Link in England that some of you might know, my reflection is that we are early in our implementation journey, as Kate has spoken to, but there are lots of things that we can be proud of that we've done here. So I think just to give a bit of an overview, as Kate has just said, we had this opportunity with COVID to do something different, and maybe where we've landed now is this space that the principles were launched for Australia in early 2020. We had COVID, which drove some radical service change and design change. And we now are in an interesting position where I would say Housing First has become a bit of a buzzword. And I think as a group, we have a challenge in Australia to define what is and isn't Housing First. If you read any strategies, press releases from government, tenders from commissioning services, lots of language is using Housing First and Housing First principles, but we lack a kind of clear definition and agreement assessment of what constitutes high fidelity provision. So I thought it might be interesting for you to hear 3 examples of service delivery, which I think highlight differences in how programs have been developed and also evolved in their Housing First journey. So one I wanted to highlight is in Western Australia, so where Tina is based, and it was the 50-50 project, 50 lives, 50 homes, led by the organisation RUA. So my understanding is that this group of services really came together and decided to take a collective impact approach and focus on developing strong collaboration in the sector. It's quite staggering to me. There was over 50 support providers across at least 30 separate organisations across homelessness, health and justice who came together, pooled funding, pooled resources, and wanted to start by focusing on housing and supporting 50 of the most chronic people experiencing homelessness and rough sleeping in the city of Perth. And they achieved this goal, and then they just kept building on it. So there's been some great evaluation work done, which you can look up, and it shows that 427 people have been supported overall. And there has been some good housing outcomes and also some really excellent data showing a reduction in hospital utilisation after getting housing, and also a reduction in contacts with the justice system. They did some really interesting flexible work, which is unusual in Australia, to do after hours support or 24 hours a day support, where they were able to have this after hours service that also let people have a point of contact if their initial service time had ended. So if they'd reached the end of that support period, they could still have this touch point back into the program by being able to call the after hours service, which was we would say a workaround that the services came up with to be able to provide that flexible ongoing support, which we know is important in Housing First, despite not being funded to really do that. There was some staggering figures there around how long it still took to get people housed, even when they were in this priority program. So the length of time on average was 207 days. And I think very shockingly, it was 1.7 times longer for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people than non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This program has, in terms of the evaluation and people I've spoken to, really led to a change in the system in the state of Western Australia, which Tina may speak to as well, but it has led to the state government having their strategy and their action plan focused on embedding Housing First principles. And this one program has now developed into a big collaborative project called the Zero Project, which is based on the Advanced to Zero methodology, if anyone is familiar with that. So supporting local communities to develop by name list data of people who are sleeping rough and using Housing First principles to keep ending rough sleeping homelessness. The second program I'd like to highlight is in my city where I live, Melbourne, called Journey to Social Inclusion by Sacred Heart Mission. And again, fantastic data behind this program if you want to read up more. It's a very rigorous research-based program. They've been very strongly trauma-informed and I would say very intelligent in how they have commissioned the service and how they've advocated for commissioning. So it's been a defined 3-year support program. So they would acknowledge themselves that is not in line with flexible support for as long as needed, but is probably lengthy in the Australian context. And so as part of the social impact investment funding that the state government provides, if the state government didn't house the program participants within a time frame, they got a financial penalty to the government. So the government was, we would say, on the hook, needed to provide the housing, otherwise they were going to pay money, which unsurprisingly is very effective when you bring the dollars into it like this. So they've had great tenancy sustainment rates over long periods of time and lengthy evaluations. And they've also measured a decline in the need for health services. They've got some costings, which suggest they've created savings to the state government for each person that they've supported due to not needing to utilise hospital beds, psychiatric admissions, justice system, etc. And they've really demonstrated an ability to increase the scale because they kept scaling up and they've done that with like very rigorous measurement and data and evaluation. And then the third program I thought I'd highlight is the Street to Home pilots that Kate spoke to, which began after that federal government investment in Housing First programs. And I work in the one in Melbourne and I have done for many years. So I would say that what's happened across the country is that the program implementation has really changed over time depending on the local context. Some programs in parts of the country haven't been able to maintain fidelity due to funding contracts tightening, and what we would say is program drift. So in some areas, the program seems to have moved more to providing assertive outreach to connect with rough sleepers, but not being able to maintain low caseloads or priority access to housing. Speaking for Melbourne and the team that I'm part of, we have really tried to maintain strong fidelity to Housing First principles, despite our funding contracts not providing for that ongoing open-ended support. And I think my reflection is that this is the significant shift we need to try and work on with government, with commissioners, because there is still this expectation of throughput, we would say, and this expectation that people will improve and will no longer need the intensive support that is provided for Housing First. The evaluation of the Melbourne program after the first 3 years found good housing retention rates, as you would see in any other Housing First program, but it identified even then that the lack of housing provided with the program was the key challenge the program faced, and it's remained the case. Also, to Kate's point of how many people, it's still at almost pilot level stage. So it's very small. There's 6 workers and 2 nurses embedded in the team in a city of 6 million people. So we can support around 50 people at a time, but it's nowhere near meeting the demand. And I think I would say that from my perspective, I'm proud of the work that my team and my organisation has done to continue to support us to hold to fidelity as much as possible. So our caseloads are low. It's 8 per worker, which I know may be high for some of you, but it's low for us. We can separate housing and support. We prioritise choice and self-determination for people in their support. And as much as possible, we pride ourselves on providing very sticky support for as long as needed. So we do have a gentleman still that we're supporting who has been with the team for 10 years. And that's very much an outlier, I would say, in the sector. And we can't support everyone for that long, but we do have the flexibility to move and shift as we need to. So I wanted to just highlight, I think if I could summarize those 3 bright spots, what I see as leading to those success stories are, in the first instance, excellent collaboration in the sector. In the second, some very clever contracts and a focus on really rigorous data collection and evaluation. And the last one, it maybe comes down to some passion and individuals still driving an understanding of fidelity. And they've all led to some good outcomes for the sector. I think I'll throw it over to Tina.
Yeah, Tina, this is your time.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge where I am coming from, which is Noongar country, Whadjuk country. And it's really important that we acknowledge where we are, because this is and always was Aboriginal land. So that's the significance and the respect that we give to each other. So my name's Tina Ugle, and I'm the Managing Director of Noongar Mia Mia. Noongar Mia Mia is a not-for-profit Aboriginal, wholly funded, owned organisation that provides housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. The Torres Strait Islands is an island just off Australia. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. And they are First Nation people too. So we always include the Torres Strait Islander people. And basically we have we're a very small community housing provider. We have 97, nearly 100 properties. We own some, and we also head lease off the government, which is called Department of Communities Housing. With that, we also have a Housing First program, which is called Murich Maya. Murich meaning in Noongar language amazing, and Maya, which is Noongar Mia Mia, is shelter. So we call that Murich Maya, and that is a Housing First program. And we have about 55 Aboriginal homeless people. We've housed 30, and we've only got 8 caseworkers. So it's very intensive. So the clients are entrenched in homelessness. Probably haven't lived in a house for 20 years. So basically they couch surf, they live on the streets. There's lots of little hiding spots everywhere in Western Australia. So we manage that program, and we also have a tenancy support program where it's okay to get a house, but you need to provide that support to the people to sustain their tenancy. So, and that can be really difficult for us because we're very diverse culturally. We all have a distinctive language. There's about 250 distinct languages in Australia, and we're just the Noongar, the southwest of Western Australia. So I thought we'd show a video on just what we do, and then the reason why I'll explain the reason we got the Housing First principles, and we thought, wow, that's really great, but that doesn't suit us with our people. We need to change the principles to the Noongar Housing First principles, and it's just adopting cultural values, to help us align with our behaviours within our organisation, and educating other housing providers on how to approach Aboriginal people. And so we've got 6 principles, which is a right to a home with cultural connections, choice and self-determination, strengthening our wiran, which is our spirit, flexible and culturally appropriate support, and culturally appropriate active engagement, social, cultural and community inclusion. So, so these principles have now become a part of what we do. It's our cultural code of conduct, and I guess the scope and the purpose of developing the Noongar Housing First principles was to support service providers to create a culturally safe environment in housing and support services for Noongar people experiencing homelessness, and we use the guidelines of the principles for Australia. A lot of it, we call it joint cooling, which means going along together to achieve a greater collective impact through meaningful partnerships and strong relationships. So for us, developing partnerships with our housing providers, our non-Indigenous housing providers, is really important to build alliances. And I've worked very hard since I've been here to try and do that. So I guess it's about looking at your tenant in a different way. It's really hard if you are of colour here, it's very hard to get a rental because they see the colour of your skin. So that's why it's really important that Noongar Mia Mia obtain more housing stock so that we can manage our people. I have 99% of all my staff are Noongars. I have one New Zealander Māori girl, and she's married to an Aboriginal man here, and we work extremely hard every day to try and house our mob, and we say mob, which is our people, and you'll kind of get that all around Australia with the Indigenous people. So I think I've got a bit of video. So this just gives you a bit of insight into our company, and you'll see some staff and tenants having a chat.
At Noongar Mia Mia, our vision is grounded in a fundamental belief that every individual has the right to a home, a place where they can forge deep cultural connections, exercise their choices, and determine their destiny. Our mission centres around 5 core principles: the right to a home with cultural connections, choice and self-determination, strengthening spirit, flexible cultural appropriate support, and cultural appropriate and active engagement.
Noongar Mia Mia is a not-for-profit Aboriginal community housing provider that provides accommodation for Aboriginal people, in particular Noongar people. Our purpose is to ensure that our mob are housed in safe and affordable housing in Noongar Budja. We have a tenancy support service called Bulu Mort, where we provide support to our tenants in the homes to ensure that they sustain their tenancies. Bulu Mia is a partnership that we have with Wanjaning. It's a facility where it houses up to 65 people that are homeless. We have a Noongar Housing First training program where we go out to organisations and educate and train them on how to work with their Aboriginal tenants. We also have a program called Murichmaya that services our mob on the streets and also in the homes to ensure that they can find accommodation and look after their health and well-being.
Some of these people have been on the streets for up to 20 years. So they've forgotten what it's like to have a house, and they've forgotten what it's like to budget and to buy food and pay pay rent. So when we get to them, they have nothing. They have no documents. They're nobody. And that's what they feel like themselves. And then when they get their accommodation, we help them furnish the place, help them get established in that house. We help them navigate all the services that are out there. And then as we go further in their casework, we look at helping them get their driver's licence, helping them with educational needs. So all those basic things that a lot of us kind of take for granted, that's a big thing for our guys. Going forward, it would be great if we could expand the program and get more staff. It'd be lovely to be able to get a day centre where people can come for the day, have a meal, do some art. We'd be able to just greet people and cook and teach them to cook and teach them all those living skills, bring them all together into one area and offer all of these different programs would just be ideal.
Noongar Mia Mia is very important. I worked with so many agencies that pretty much just threw their hands up in the air and said they couldn't help. I think there's probably a lot of families out there going through the same thing that I'm going through, and Noongar Mia is the only one in southwest WA that could help me. I don't know really where I would be if Noongar Mia didn't step in. I'd probably be still couch surfing with the kids.
There's no better feeling than having your own, having my kids stable just to go to school. And then little simple things, having the own room, just, my kids are 10 times happier than where we was. No better feeling than having our own place, and honestly, struggles that we went through to just, I've moved in with nothing. Noongar Mia helped with everything. Kids even got clothes, pillows, sheets, blankets. You even helped with, the food, just to get us out of that situation. And honestly, I don't know what we would have done.
If you follow what's in here, I reckon I'll be on the streets. But what Mia does, it's unbelievable. And there for everyone, not only me, for everyone. And when I got a house with you, Mob, it was good. You helped me a lot. You done everything for me. Looked after me. You might say you fed me. I never looked back.
We are committed to working hand in hand with our community, our partners and our supporters to build not just houses, but homes that are filled with love, culture and a sense of belonging. Together, we can ensure that every individual, every family and every child in our community has the opportunity to experience the warmth and security of a true home.
So I hope you like that. That's a bit about where I work. And yeah, I guess it's about bringing our language into, like I said, there's a lot of language groups in Australia, in Western Australia. So a lot of the mob from the Northern Territory, from the Kimberleys will come to Perth. So we have to be able to adapt to their culture because they're different to our culture in terms of their law, the way they, the kinship and all sorts of, so all my staff are familiar with all of the different, I guess you could say, skin groups throughout Western Australia, and we constantly train the staff. We have language classes. Sandra Harben delivers the Noongar Cultural First Housing Principles. She's amazing. She's an elder here in Western Australia and can speak the language, and she helps us a lot in understanding our culture, and we learn every day. So it's something that we want to embed in every housing organisation or housing delivering the Housing First principles, is have that part of the cultural side connected. So that's why we're actually rolling out some training to 20 staff members, which is, it's little, but 20 staff members with Department of Housing. So we'll be doing that next week, and that's going to be really interesting. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Tina, for your presentation and all your words. It was very interesting and the video was amazing. So yeah, we open now a brief Q&A session. We have 7 minutes left. I can see that there was already one question on the chat. Kate already answered it. So feel free to write any questions on the chat box. And I would like to start with one question to any of you three. So based on your experience, what will you say that just in terms of sum it up, what could be the key lessons learned until now and best practices for implementing Housing First programs in the Australian context?
I think for me, because we have a Housing First program, is to continue the funding, because if it stops, where are all these people going to go? What support are they going to have? So it's, being an Aboriginal organisation, not for profit, we are very self-determined and we do get a lot of donations and so forth that we put to good use, but it's definitely resources and increasing the capacity of Aboriginal housing organisations is definitely a big thing for me.
Thanks, Tina. We have one person raising the hand.
Yes, sorry, I've got no camera. One of the problems that I know exists in UK is Housing First is a wonderful label and it's a great thing. But very often it actually is housing eventually. So it's after we've exhausted everything else, we've made you run through the ringer. Oh, okay, we'll give you somewhere to live, but we'll call it Housing First. How close to the honest model of Housing First is, here's the accommodation, here's the support, we'll go from that now, are you? And if you're a lot closer than we are, can we get some examples, please, of how to make our government think better?
I'm happy to take this one, Stan. I was going to say, and I didn't, that when I visited services, it struck me that there are some services, maybe like in the Netherlands, I remember seeing that the person and the housing are matched, and that's when the Housing First support begins. And I would say that's not where we are in Australia. My experience is we are often doing the assertive outreach to people, like you say, that have exhausted other options in the system. And so therefore they are identified as requiring Housing First support. So I'm sorry, I don't necessarily think we're much further along, and I don't have any magic solutions.
No, it's just, I think that Housing First is a great concept, but it's very often just nothing more than a buzzword, really. You'll get somebody who's in the system using building-based services, and they will try everything else, they will bounce in and out, and then eventually somebody goes, oh, we'll give them some accommodation and we'll call it Housing First, even though they've been trapped in the system for a decade. It's not really Housing First, and I want to see that bit strengthened, because in its raw beauty, providing someone with a home and then working with them to go through the rest of the things they need to piece together is where we should all be at, because everything starts from a stable background. But I think that's down to how we challenge it and also how we frame it.
Yeah, and perhaps speaking to Arturo's first question, also for us as a country to work on our non-negotiables like Homeless Link has done, or a more fidelity guidance that I know Homeless Link is working on and other countries have too. So we can clearly point to where services are delivering high fidelity Housing First rather than what you might be describing, Stan. Yeah.
So if I could just make one other point, I think you experienced the same as what we did in the UK, is when COVID hit, lots of temporary accommodation was found to put a roof over people's heads and to keep them safe. I'm quite sceptical and question whether it was because they didn't want the general population being reinfected by those bloody homeless, right? But I think it was a great example of what Housing First can really be about. It could just be getting people in somewhere and then working with them. But like you, we experienced the same sort of thing. At the back end of that, it was all kind of shuffled off very quietly, and lots of those people who were helped off the street were no longer being helped, and the only alternative was for them to return back to the street, and it undid all of that good work.
One of the things that I think homeless services have become really good at in Australia is navigating other service systems. So whilst we often don't have the resources to provide support to people within the homelessness service system, a lot of workers have become very skilled at finding that support for people in other allied service systems. So connecting them in with mental health support, or connecting them in with community programs that might provide that social inclusion, or connecting them in with Aboriginal community controlled organisations so that they can get a range of services there. So there's lots of sort of bright spots, as Rosie was talking about. And one of the things that happens around housing access is that sometimes we can get access to housing, but often the challenge across the whole service system is that it becomes a question about who gets priority. So there is a small amount of housing, and sometimes people who are chronically homeless might get more priority through mechanisms like, if someone's been on the street for 10 years, they can get their application for housing backdated 10 years. So then that sort of pushes them to the front of the queue to get housing. And sometimes with mechanisms like that, it is possible to deliver a quick housing outcome, or more quick than it would otherwise be. But across the whole homelessness service system, the challenge then is that you're not providing that house to someone in a more preventative way. So homeless workers have to choose between, do you provide that available housing vacancy to someone who's chronically homeless, or, for example, to a teenager who can't live safely at home and needs housing placement. So those are the kinds of choices that workers have to make.
Thanks, Kate. It's already 11:30 here, but we still have time for one more question that is on the chat. How do you keep your staff motivated when there is so little access to housing?
Well, with my staff, we do a lot of trauma-informed supervision, because a lot of our mob, we are connected. So my staff will know people that are on the street. That could be their uncle, great uncle, or they know family. So then they start relying heavily on the emotions of my staff. And so we do team building, I'm always encouraging them. People need some time out. They need time out. It's just, it is very depressing when you see your people people, your elders, homeless, and there's nothing you can do except give them the support, you know, in terms of maybe putting them in respite. And there is, like Kate said, there's a lot of services that we link into, and we're getting a common ground built in Western Australia. It's 100-bed in Fremantle and Perth, and we also have a Wunjinning Aboriginal Corporation, which is another Aboriginal corporation that is quite large, looks after alcohol and drug and sort of all that kind of support services. The government fund them to manage a 65-bed, between 60 homeless people stay in this facility in the city, and they run that amazing, and we're partners with them. So we have a couple of staff over there that help with the Aboriginal people, which majority are, unfortunately. So yeah, that's what I do. What we all kind of pat each other on the back when there's achievements and tell good stories, and yeah.
All right, thank you, Tina. Thank you also, Kate, and thank you, Rosie, and thank you all for joining us today. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. We appreciate our speakers' insights and your active participation, and I think we like this format of 1-hour webinar because we always end up wanting to know more. So feel free to contact our speakers and to contact us. Till next time, thank you all of you. Take care and see you soon.